Every business has critical assets that are at risk of theft or destruction from digital threats. In fact, the threat of cyber theft is at an unprecedented level, whether from external attacks, errant employees, or malicious insiders. Data breaches expose not only the personal information of clients, customers, and employees, but also confidential corporate information. Recent attacks have targeted proprietary designs and business plans, as well as customer lists and leads. What makes these occurrences even more troubling is that regulators, along with the media and the courts, are often holding financial executives personally responsible for data breaches. In fact, every event opens a Pandora's box of legal and career headaches that could dog a CFO for months or even years. Our cameras were on hand for a panel discussion at the recent FEI Summit, where panelists offered guidance to financial executives who should be looking to protect themselves while also safeguarding their organization, their employees, and their customers. Participating in the program are Michael Rubin, a partner with Wilson, Sonsini, Goodrich & Rosati, and Roland Cloutier, Vice President and Chief Security Officer with ADP. The moderator is Michael Kurza, Senior Vice President and CFO of Via West.
Michael, I know you've worked with a number of your clients around some of these, in particular a spear phishing situation that's occurred over the last couple of years, not just around undisclosed or unapproved wires, but also around some W-2 releases. Maybe you can tell us a little bit about that.
That's right. And so for those of you who don't know, phishing emails are often the stuff that clogs your personal email boxes, the Nigerian princess looking for money. They're not very effective. We've become accustomed to them. Spear phishing is a more sophisticated social engineering attack, and they have become much more in vogue as a technological measure by the attackers to get information, because they can get past a lot of the technical infrastructure that a company can have to protect its information. So, as Mike just mentioned, I dealt a lot last year with a lot of situations where we would have unapproved wires being sent out. The CFO sent an email instructing someone to send $4 million, $250,000 to an account, and it went out with no checks, and then usually within about 30 seconds of it going out, the light bulb went off saying, oh my God, and then we'd have follow-up. Very little you can do there. That doesn't directly implicate a data security issue, although I can tell you it's usually part of the same symptom that can be there. We've seen a relatively sophisticated new attack because it's the social engineering, which is W-2 related. I can't disclose the identity of my clients who've suffered this in the past few weeks because they've luckily had no significant fallout in terms of litigation or regulatory investigation. But as I've said, quite a few clients have had this problem where, and it's 4 in the past couple of weeks, and 2 had the emails come from the CFO, where the CFO will send an email internal to the company very casually saying, hey, Diane, I need to get all of the employees' W-2s. Could you zip them up into a PDF file and email them to me? 10 minutes later, that email is sent off. One was discovered the next day. One was discovered 2 weeks later when in a break room someone mentioned it and they said they never asked for it. Those emails don't actually originate from the CFOs. But that's a very good example where the apparent authority of the position can result in a huge breach of security at the company. Seagate is an example. Seagate's not my client, but Seagate is now being sued for this, of a significant data breach lawsuit. I can tell you, I defend data breach lawsuits. I defend a lot of lawsuits. That's a pretty hard one to defend, because even in the case of my client where it was a discovery in one business day, by Monday morning, we found that upwards of 50% of the individuals on that account had their tax refunds looted. So it's a significant problem, and in terms of regulatory fallout, because we have to provide data breach notifications, those standards are tightening. There is a race around data security where the states find that the higher the standards they put out, the better they look. There's no negative repercussions to doing that. You now have to provide notice to attorneys general. So if you have, in some states, as few as one consumer in that state affected, you have to notify the attorney general. Fortunately for these clients, the total number of employees is low. Their business their businesses are relatively unknown. They're not major names. But if you are a more significant player in a market and you catch the attention of your attorney general, this is the very sort of thing that can trigger an investigation. And once that investigation opens, they do look at all of the other standard things that a cybersecurity investigation would include. And to have it originate around the CFO makes it an extraordinarily uncomfortable place for it to start.
Roland, you mentioned that you're part of the CFO organization within your company. Maybe you can talk a little bit about how you guys have created a control structure, not just within the organization, but within your employee base to help overcome some of these challenges that the CFO is seeing.
Our approach is pretty simple. You know, we're risk adverse, but B, cyber is just another component of risk, and whether it's financial revenue risk, implications of different markets we serve, it's impact to brand, it is impact to regulatory considerations or fines. I mean, it's a massive risk, and so like ERM and a few of these areas, we roll into the CFO because there's a financial implication at the end. We have found that some of the best ways to drive that transparency, to ensure we have a discussion as a business around the financial objectives of our cyber defensive strategy is to use industry standard measurements and mechanisms. So meaning we use a process called FAIR, which is just a financial actuary measuring model, but it's good for our business, and there are several of these out there that allow us to look at these risks, the financial implication to the market and to our business, and be able to have a reasonable conversation with business leaders and with our financial executives. I think the second part, or the question that you brought up, is how do you address this with people? Because at the end of the day, it is a people issue. There's an argument to be made that there's just a certain part of humanity that you are not going to be able to change. That no matter how much you train them, no matter how much slideware you put them through, that you're going to have to implement technologies. And for instance, in the spear phishing technology, that's an email that comes from the outside. It says the individual's name, but when you click on reply, essentially it's going to a Gmail account or a Hotmail account or something like that. There are technologies out there today that would say that name does not match that, and so kill it, right? So there are technologies to do that. However, training people to understand the risk, being proactive with them, means you have to understand how people learn. So the way that we used to teach people, right, those 40-minute PowerPoints that you torture them with every year, next slide, right? These web-based training, we've migrated from that. And we do a couple different things. First is we educate through multimedia mechanisms, number one, because people watch TV, people use their phones, people use apps, so we do that. We give them 2-minute videos. People's attention spans are very small, so we compact it into that, and we teach them something. And then we teach them something next week. Then we teach them something the week after. So we're giving it through the entire year, dribs and drabs, videos, blogs. We've figured out that we can't just say we're the security people and we're going to tell them this is the way they're going to do it, because after slide 6, they're done. And the next thing we do is we test them. If you're in our organization, you will be spearphished. It's just keeping on that topic. Mm-hmm. So we actually hire outside third-party companies to come and actually test our people. And then what we do is we look at where we failed, how did we not educate them right, and what populace, right? So were they all executive admins that we got? Well, that's problematic. Think what they have access to. We're going to shift resources, funding, and training over to them and do something special for them. Were they CSRs or client service representatives? Was that the biggest number? Right? So we're going to use the information to manage our business, or my business, which is protecting the company, as we test our people. So that's probably the biggest change we've seen in the last few years.
Michael, tell us a little bit, as these trainings are constantly evolving. When you have your clients, what are some of the pieces of advice that you're bringing to them in terms of preparing their control infrastructure as it relates to cybersecurity?
Sure, and I'll say it varies very significantly. And I'll say the single most challenging factor, and this is getting a little bit better with the passage of time, but the single most challenging factor is the cultural dynamics inside the company. We see now that the CFO position is the position that either is directly responsible for cybersecurity in a significant minority of companies. And then there's a CIO position in which if it's recognized that that's a position that exists. The CFO still has some role to play, obviously, because there's funds that need to be allocated and approved. The serious disconnect that is the most problematic is that there is another organization inside the company that is always involved, and that's the IT organization. But the C-suite's always up here, and until pretty recently at most companies, the IT organization was down here. That disconnect has been a rather significant problem, because unless you happen to have a forward-thinking company with a forward-thinking CFO, a forward-thinking CEO, the rest of the C-suite thinking about it, and the entire board who understands what's at issue, which can often be reduced to some sort of financial metric, as Roland was saying, and depending on the particular industry that the company's in, there's lots of ways to approach that. Some of it is to help the company understand, okay, if you have a problem here, it's going to cost you X dollars and X cents. Some of it is to walk through the regulatory implications. Regulators are getting more and more interested in this. Just a few years ago, the only real regulator focused in this area was the Federal Trade Commission. The Federal Trade Commission has a significant body of law that has, it's not wrong to say, provided the guidance for a significant amount of companies in how they deal with their data security. NIST at the technical level, but in a lot of other ways in terms of building out a program at an operational level, the Federal Trade Commission. The state's attorneys general are very involved too. They operate very differently. They're much more political. But others are getting involved. The Federal Communications Commission is now involved. HHS is now more involved on the HIPAA side.
The U.S. Attorney's Office is always my favorite call.
Yes, exactly. And so, I mean, I have had, it used to be that a matter was a big matter in the U.S. if you had the FTC, states attorneys general, and the DOJ involved. And of course, you have class action plaintiffs. But when you have those other three involved, the class action plaintiffs aren't your big deal. And we are now seeing matters where it's the FTC, the FCC, HHS, and
SEC.
states.
For public companies,
Yes,
SEC.
yes. And the SEC, exactly, if you can get into a disclosure problem, all on the same matter. And they're very interested in data security too. And the more interesting the data, health data, payment card information, location data, children's data, the more interesting it is, the more they glom onto it. That, understanding the regulatory posture, and this is not a doom and gloom story. This is a real story that happens pretty regularly to companies.
Yeah, so I agree with that so much. And then, you know, from an I'd like to hit on 2 points that you just made because it's exceptional. First is oversight and how we think about financial leadership and executive leadership having a say in this transparency. You know, depends how you look at it. I'm fortunate where we have an executive security council that includes CFO, general counsel, our president of technology, our chief of HR, our head of client experience, me, and our CEO. We meet every month on security issues, every month, without fail. To get that time from those level of executives for that sort of focus is absolutely incredible for a company. I'm actually a fortunate person. Every quarter, we brief our board. So predominantly in the audit committee area, where we give them cyber updates on programs, incidents, and our scorecard. Every other quarter, we meet with a full board. And 1 month or 1 quarter, it's around a crisis management, disaster planning, and one of the other months is around cyber. And so it's this rolling schedule where everybody's involved to drive this discussion of transparency and understanding. The second point is crisis management. So I live in a world where we can have a tsunami in Chennai and take out one of our operating facilities for Asia, or I can have an issue where a blizzard takes out 2/3 of the East Coast and potentially impacts our call centers, or a fire in our Paris data center that took out 80% of our operating capacity in Europe a few years ago, right? These are real things that happen on a daily basis. We stood up our crisis management program 44 times last year. 17 major crises globally that would have impacted clients. 44 where we actually stood up the team. Last year, by the way, we follow a global standard that was actually introduced out of the U.S. National Wildfire Protection Fire Service around crisis management. And everybody in our company that is responsible for crisis management, from the CEO down, has gone through the crisis management training and has gone through tabletop exercise, including what we call regional crisis response teams in every major operating GL. Same training, same level of tabletop exercise. And when we respond to an incident, everybody knows how to respond. Very hard to do, very time-consuming. It ain't cheap, but at the end of the day, we have an ability to understand what we missed, what we need to learn, what we need to bring into this learning cycle every single time. And it's from which attorneys, which law firms that will help us through it, which third parties in different regions we're going to use next time, what our corporate messaging requirements need to be, how we effectively communicate with regulators during those times. And so that all of those things come out of these major issues. And I get it, we're on a broader scale, but even at a smaller scale, who do I call? What do I do? And how do I manage my company through a crisis, including what should I be expecting from a financial perspective to be able to prepare for? Those things need to happen way before an incident actually happens.
Roland, you talked a little bit about your boards and how you guys talk about this at every board meeting. Maybe you can share a little bit about the process that you guys go into, not just to prepare for the meetings, but some of the questions that the board members are looking to you and the security team to answer.
Yeah, first I come in with a picture of the sky falling. No, I'm just kidding. So obviously there is a lot of preparation that goes behind it. We use, if you think about our security organization, if you were to think about it from a revenue perspective, we're about ready to go public, right? So we have our own business operations team, and they spend time preparing for that meeting. But the discussions that we have are around really impact to risk, right? What are the company's biggest risks? What are our biggest gaps? How are we addressing those? How are we using the resources? And what is our effectiveness to change that? That's what we talk a lot about, even at the board level. And impact to future risks of the firm, not just cyber risks, but revenue risks. We talk about data privacy, right? Mm-hmm. For those of you that used to be Safe Harbor certified, because that doesn't exist anymore, we talk about our plans around BCRs, or binding corporate rules, because if we don't have those, I can't operate in Europe. I lose $2 billion worth of revenue. Now that's a bad day, right? So we talk about those sort of futuristic things and how we're reducing that. Interesting is some of the questions that come back. What's great is that our board has been infused with cybersecurity experts for the last couple of years, last few years. It's actually great. I have the former head of one of the big government SIs that she ran their cybersecurity group. I have one of your clients actually just left our board, who's the head of a major multinational security group. Now we have another one that's on. And so the questions I get from them are supportive and probing. Roland, I understand that this is happening in other companies, and this is how they handle them. How are you handling them? And how is that different, and what can we expect? So from the technical people, I get that. From, say, the head of our audit or our finance chair, they want to get into what is the potential impact? So what is that financial impact of a brand or non-processing or an aggregated incident that hits this market based on known regulatory fines that could happen, X, Y, Z? What is our potential financial or criminal liability, right? So they want to get into broader context issues like that. You know, they don't get into the bits and the bytes, but I will tell you that they definitely read the Wall Street Journal, and they definitely participate in things like NACD, where they're getting bulletins on what they should ask, and they're asking fair questions. Roland, what's the health of our IT environment from a security perspective, and what is that in comparison to the normalized industry rates? And they want to know that. So I come prepared with some of that information, just knowing that type of detail they may ask.
Michael, obviously the name of the panel here is it's personal for the CFO. Can you talk a little bit about what some of the ramifications for maybe not just the CFO, but the larger C-suite would be if they decide not to present this posture or take this seriously?
Sure, absolutely. And they can take a lot of different forms, so I'll talk about them in a lot of different forms. Let's look at some of the bigger breaches that have happened recently. And these are good examples because they're out in the public. There are all sorts of other examples that I'll relay to you that are anecdotal from my own history, but that you wouldn't know about because they didn't make the front of the Wall Street Journal. Target's a great example, right? The Target breach was really pretty epic, made some very bad law in Minnesota, but maybe we'll get that cleaned up someday. But the CEO lost his job. The CEO lost his job. When the Senate committee called someone to testify, it was the CFO who had to testify. It was the CFO who had to sit in front of Congress and talk about day by day what the intrusion was, day by day what the remediation was. And that's an impact. That's a reputational impact on that individual. Those litigations settled, but in a litigation context, we talk about dollars and cents. We talk about doing a risk analysis. Not every communication that a CFO sends is going to be with the general counsel and is going to be privileged. Even a lot of business-oriented communications with the general counsel wouldn't be privileged because they wouldn't be for legal advice. And the plaintiff's lawyers are getting smarter. And if you think back to historical bean counting issues coming up in litigation, GM litigation from the past, we're not going to fix this minor problem because the cost of paying for the unforeseen death of these 42 people is more expensive, that sort of stuff. Obviously worse, but the emails that are internal to the CFO's communications figuring out how much the appropriate amount to spend is, or pushing to get certain contracts executed by the close of the quarter, and then you find that those contracts don't include data security provisions because the negotiation period was cut off or something like that. Those emails will come out in discovery, and then that's a very awkward deposition. That's civil litigation. Depending on the company and depending on the role the CFO has, regulators can go after individuals. I have worked, so I litigate, but I also represent companies in regulatory investigations. My firm has a very big FTC practice, and I also head up the state AG practice. I said a few minutes ago that the state AG practice is different than the FTC. It's a little bit more political. We've got 50 states plus the District of Columbia. That's a lot of competition. Everyone trying to outdo the other. We have a new phenomenon going now at the federal level, which is the federal agencies are trying to outdo each other now, too. The FTC isn't going to be left to show that it's not doing a good job now that the FCC is on the scene. That is a challenge to companies. Because even where the FTC might have been reasonable before, they're not. Even where they might have just gone after the company before, now they're naming founders, now they're naming C-suite individuals. I'll be frank, I actually can't think of a situation where it was a CFO named, but I could easily spin out a hypothetical where that absolutely could be the case. If it was the CFO who was the prime cause for the key data security elements not being put in place. Or if it was a company where CFO did have ultimate responsibility for cybersecurity and that went terribly wrong. So those are ultimately, to me, if I'm the CFO and I'm thinking through this, those are the scarier problems. I don't particularly want to be sitting at the Senate as a CFO having to defend it. But the more practical situation is you lose your job. And I don't think that the lesson there is to take a CYA approach. I think the lesson is to understand the issues and try to build a more teamwork approach. No, certainly, as a CFO, you can't solve this problem yourself unless you happen to be a brilliant multitasker and you're the CIO understanding all those issues too. You have to maybe aspire to what the world Roland lives in, which is an extraordinarily lucky position for someone in his position, but a really lucky position for his CFO, his CEO, and everyone who's using the product because they're thinking about things. That's the kind of place you want to be thinking of a company that is all rowing in the same direction. And that can be tough, but that's sort of what I would think of.
But I think the CFO can start it, right? Because, I mean, think about your normal planning process, right? At the end of the year as you're focusing on your next fiscal year, and the FP&A organization or a person, depending how, who's doing it, the reality is that you can set structure and process in place to answer some really basic questions, right? What is your current risk posture as assigned to you by your ERM? What is the recommended cybersecurity strategy as recommended by the cyber team? And what's your spend, right? So how do we make the review of your risk decisions of the people that you're assigning targets and budgets to, right? How are you making that part of your FP&A process, number one? Number two, ensuring things like within the COGS line, if you have a product, that there's a line item for security, and explain how those individuals are going to be implementing security, making that a requirement. There are other interesting ways, depending on your industry, that the CFO can have a really big voice in not setting the requirement, but opening the discussion to be transparent to the organization, to say, we take it seriously. It needs to be part of your planning as a business leader and executive in the company, and we're going to hold you accountable, as a leader, as CFO, as part of the leadership team. And we're going to start at the basics by how you manage your budget. That alone sets a tone across the entire organization that you'd be surprised. So I think whether the security organizations or risk organizations or CIO organizations roll up to a CFO or not, they still have a huge impact just by how they make the entire organization work.
As a couple of follow-ups for the group, what are some of the takeaways that you would have for the group, Michael? I know we've talked a lot about planning, but if there's 2 or 3 things that the group here should take away, what are those?
So I'm going to hit a couple points I've made, but I would say this. Make sure your organization is at least having this conversation, and ideally work towards having a task force type approach. Now, if you're a very small company, the task force can be 1 or 2 or 3 people. But this to get your company into the right posture isn't something that can be done by one person. Particularly if you are the CFO, you're moving into this, you want to have a cross-functional group, from my perspective, that involves CFO, the general counsel or legal, and the IT organization. Move towards that. Make sure that you have an incident response plan in place. Work towards building that out. That team can be brought together to do that. It's a very easy way to get those people involved. They'll all be interested. I can say it's quite difficult to build that incident response plan as any one member of that group, because some people don't know where the various pieces fit in, and you have to figure out where all those pieces fit in. As a couple of very practical points, but I think important ones, cybersecurity insurance. You should have it. There's no good reason not to have it now. It's easy to get, the policies are well defined, and they cover most problems. Now, they have exclusions, and if you have a lot of holes in your system, you might have an exclusion, but there's that. And depending on the maturity of your organization and where you are, you might want to go back and review your vendor contracts and see where they are and see what they look like. The target breach was through a vendor. I mean, you're only as strong as your weakest link, and your vendors often have significant access to your systems, and they may not have very many good controls. At the very least, you want to be able to show that at the papering stage of those relationships, you were thinking about data security. Now, that may not be enforceable. The indemnification obligations may be worth nothing. If it's a small vendor, they may not be worth the money it's written on, but it is worth what the document shows about your state of mind. Because in litigation, in a regulatory investigation, all those agreements are going to be requested. And if none of them show a data security provision or things along those lines, it shows a lack of forethought that will be held against the company. Those are some very small practical things that can be done rather easily. Obviously, there's the entire technical flood that needs to get done, but that's too much of a challenge to bite off at once. That's a bigger project.
Sure. Roland?
Yeah, I would leave you with two thoughts. First is, ask me questions. If you have a person that's an IT security person or a CISO or an EIEIO, whatever you call them, ask them what they're spending their money on, how it's impacting the current risk posture, and how do they know? It's a hard question. How do you know? Show me. How did we measure that? And what's the impact of the business, right? Educate yourself through asking me those questions. The second I've already mentioned, make cyber initiatives part of your process, right? How are we defending the organization, ensuring business process availability, and security through our FP&A process in general. Those are two things you can do tomorrow that will really, really drive the extent at which your company is prepared for these type of cyber issues.